Hello, it is I, Serendipity Wyrd, here today to talk to you about some of my experiences about working with Deity and a little bit about how you could work with Deity if you so choose, what that might be like, what you might need to know. This is a question that I see come up all the time in witchy communities, especially where there are new practitioners, new witches. It's always like, how do I begin to start working with Deity? Or, do I have to have a patron deity or a matron deity? I am here to give you answers to these questions based on my own experiences, because those are the experiences I have. So, let's get started. As always, or at least for now, we're not going to edit this at all, so we'll see how this freaking goes. I'm sorry this wasn't up last week. I went on this huge ramble and then just kind of got cut off. I don't know, energetically, I just lost all motivation or something. I just froze and I was like, oh, okay. Then the whole week was just a little wonky. So, but we're back. We're here. We're going to get a video up this week. So, first of all, I am specifically choosing the word deity because it is non-gendered. I try to make it a point in a lot of my language to not use gendered language as much as possible, partially because I myself am non-binary, even though I often identify very strongly with the feminine. I really prefer things to not really have an angle one way or the other when it's not necessary, because that gives leeway for whatever, right? Where you don't have to exist in the binary. So I like to use the word deity when talking in general about entities that I refer to as in the great beyond. Maybe they exist in the underworld, maybe they exist in the upper world, maybe they hang out kind of here in the middle realm sometimes. There are some deities that are actually known for that. But that is why I'm specifically not using terms such as god or goddess, specifically over this whole video. I will probably lean into deity more than anything else. So oftentimes I see that when people are coming into their witchiness and they are finding themselves maybe even on some type of a pagan path, not all witches are pagans, not all pagans are witches, and whatever, all of that shenanigans, but oftentimes when people are newly in the space, there becomes this concern about deity and about working with deity and about connecting with their deity, and there can be a lot of stress that I see around that. So I am here today to talk to you a bit about how that doesn't have to be that stressful. Alright, so on that subject, question 1, do you need a matron or a patron deity or a deity in general? Do you have to work with deity to be an effective witch, pagan, sorcerer, magician, whatever words you're using for yourself? No, not at all. Deity work, deity worship, deity interaction is absolutely not a requirement. And even if you choose to work with deity, there are a lot of different ways to do that. There are a lot of different outlooks. There are more of a pantheist sort of view where everything are maybe archetypes or different facets of the whole, the one. We sometimes hear that as. You might be more polytheistically bent and believe that there are many gods and you want to work with many deities. That's cool. You might be more monotheistic and choosing to only work with a singular deity, which, however you do or don't go about working with deity, I am here to tell you that's fine. You don't have to have one. You don't have to have the correct heteronormative collection of, male deity over here on the right and female deity over here on the left to be a complete witch or pagan or insert magic user name here. It's not required. So, unless you think it's required. If you think it's required, then that's awesome. Do you, witch. Do what works for you. But in the general, huge, world of witchery, deities are not required. It's totally legit to be an atheist witch or an agnostic witch, to look at that which is beyond us as maybe just spirit or as the universe. Those are legitimate outlooks. So if anyone else tells you that and you're not feeling it, I'm here to let you know you don't need a freaking deity. Okay. Now that we have that out of the way, let's take a moment. Let's breathe for a moment. I was getting a little too ranty there. So that is the first thing. On that note too, even if you do want to work with deity, there is no rush. There's no rush at all whatsoever to connect with a deity. Sometimes when we are working with deity, we do form bonds that are long lasting. There certainly are, and I have had instances where I have felt called by a deity to work with them, and people talk about that concept a lot. This calling, or there's this opinion that the deity has to choose you in order for that relationship to work. Okay, that to me is kind of like the same idea as when we looked at heteronormative male-female courtship requirements and thought, ooh, the girl can't ask the boy out. The boy must ask for her hand, or whatever silly nonsense. You don't have to wait for the deity to come to you, okay? That's also what I'm here to tell you today. If you feel like you have an interest in a deity, you can be the one that reaches out. We'll get more into that in a second. So, you know that you don't have to. You know that you don't need the correct collection of one male, one female, and there you go. You can have one deity that you work with. You can have many deities that you work with. That is up to you and your deities. Which takes us to kind of the fundamental foundation of my belief structure when it comes to working with deity. That working with deity and forming relationships with deity is not that different than forming relations with humans. Just let that sink in for a second. Why is that? Because we're human and we understand, well, for the most part, we're human, right? Like, some of that might be debatable with, some of us might feel a little inclined toward the fae folk or the mermaids or the aliens or what have you. But for the most part, we're humans. And we understand relationships through our human lens of consciousness. So, instead of freaking out about like working with a deity being this relationship structure that is really consciousness based, or like kind of head up in the clouds, and it may not make a lot of sense, or it might feel really forced into some sort of a worshipful sort of space where you as human are less important or something as the deity, and then there's this whole hierarchical structure thing that's happening, and it's can be kind of, it can definitely be disempowering, and it can be pretty difficult for people who have maybe gone through religious experiences where it was, borderline or absolutely abusive, and maybe it was really I'm not finding fantastic words to describe this at the moment, but maybe an evangelical sort of religious base where you've come out of that, you've found yourself on some sort of a witchy or a pagan space, and the idea of worshiping anything may be problematic. I am here to also tell you that is not necessarily a requirement. It may come into being somewhere, and I always recommend that over time we work to regain a relationship with words too, when words become triggering and harmful and difficult for us. like some religious context words can be, like faith, prayer, worship, stuff like that. God, even. I think it behooves us to go through some shadow work like process to get into a better relationship with those words. But besides all that, because that's like a whole nother video, you don't have to look at relationship with deity from this lens of this is some sort of I am lesser and worship sort of experience. That's not the lens I use. Now, I can totally imagine that somebody's going to take that and be like, so, you think that you are a deity? Yes and no, and that's again a whole nother conversation for a whole nother video, and I would explore that at some point. But I'm not saying that out of humans are on par with the divine point blank. I think that humans, like, we have a piece of the divine in us. Are we absolutely, deities unto ourselves? Not really. We're in these human meat suit body things, and there are a lot of limitations with that. But are we made up of kind of the same star stuff and have energies running through us that can interact with the divine energies? Yes. And that is what forms the belief structure of my outlook on working with deity. As always, because I did not give this disclaimer at the beginning, these are my views, this is my process. If this doesn't work for you, if you think what I'm telling you is absolutely ridiculous, that's okay. You're allowed to have your outlook, and it's allowed to differ from mine. And that's pretty freaking awesome, honestly. And I even welcome conversations where some level of ethical, kind, civil debate can happen and a discussion about different outlooks, because that's where learning and growth happens oftentimes. And that stuff is juicy and amazing, and I love it. So I'm not, by any stretch of the imagination, telling you that this is absolutely the only way to work with deity. Not at all. I'm giving you my processes, my ways of doing things. It's worked for me thus far, but, kind of a crazy little rebel, out of the box kind of person, so your mileage may vary for what I'm sharing. Anyway, okay, so you've gotten to a point where you're like, okay, I know I don't have to work with a deity, but I want to work with a deity. And this wraps us back around to that idea of the relationships. So you want to work with a deity. We're gonna, for a moment, forget about whether it matters if they're approaching you or you're approaching them. And just think about what a relationship is. In the culture that I am in, which is the United States in the 2000s, most people often understand the idea of the word relationship to mean specifically a romantic relationship. That drives me personally insane, and so I'm taking this opportunity to share that and go on this particular soapbox. And a relationship is simply talking about the fact that one entity is relating to another entity. We have relationships with all sorts of things. We have relationships with our pets, right? And people have written all sorts of awesome webcomics and stuff that place that sort of idea that in our human-pet relationship, that it's almost like we are the deity sort of space for the pet. But that's kind of irrelevant, but it also, we're keep going with this because we're not editing crap. Point being that you have a relationship with something that is not human, right? Because you can have a relationship with a pet, you can have a relationship with a rock, honestly. That's why I think it's hard for us to give up possession sometimes. We may not realize that we have spiritual connections to what we consider to be inanimate objects, and they are inanimate, but yeah. But we do, and all the anxiety spikes. This is probably why I got cut off last time I was doing it, because we're treading into area that it's like, I'm sharing my real beliefs and it's scary, y'all. But we are a brave little toaster, and we're gonna prevail. Okay, so relationships, you know that you can have a relationship with something that isn't just a lover, romantic partner person. You have a relationship with potentially your children, your siblings, your parents, your boss, whatever. We've established that the word relationship works for a lot of different sorts of interactions between entities. So that's why I use that word in considering how I'm relating to a deity. I am forming a relationship with them. If I am working with a deity, it's a bond that's being established in some way. And just like not every relationship you have in your life is going to be throughout your entire life, not every deity that you interact with is necessarily going to be a deity that you are continuing to work with and in relationship with throughout your entire life. Certainly, there are deities that you do form a bond with, and potentially you have bonds other lifetimes back. I believe that that absolutely happens, and that's where we get the stories where people feel called to that deity and that sort of thing, because perhaps there's already a relationship established in previous lifetimes or in future lifetimes, because time is kind of this weird spirally thing that is all happening at once. Water. One moment. Water. Fancy cup. If you don't have a vessel that you really enjoy replenishing and nourishing yourself from, I highly recommend that you acquire one. Because I love the crap out of this purple goblet. I feel super fancy and in communion with the divine when I use it. Unrelated, but tangents. It's what I do. So, you're forming a relationship with a deity. That's what you're doing when you're working with deity. That relationship may be for today. It may be a one-off kind of thing where you're making a specific petition and you are making an offering in a sort of payment for their help with a problem, and that might be it. That's legit. I'm not going to tell you that that's not a way to practice. Or you might be setting up a relationship for a long-term situation. And that's where devotional relationships come in, and that's where relationships where you might want to dedicate yourself to a specific deity come in. But that dedication aspect is not required on day one. Just like you're not gonna do any intimate activity with someone or something right away when you first meet them, normally. There are exceptions, there are exceptions. But generally speaking, the responsible thing to do in any interaction is not to jump right into incredibly intimate activities with someone or something, right? Same thing with a deity. So, how do we begin then? Because they're not human. We can't just go to the coffee shop and, have a coffee with the deity. Or can we? Perhaps. That's actually how I look at it. If I am thinking that I want to start working with a deity and they're new to me and I'm not certain where the relationship's going to go, I don't really know them at all, I start with the equivalent of coffee dates. So, and kind of stalking them, if you will. That's the best term I can think of for it. Think about when there's a person that you're interested in, and we'll use the romantic relationship context because I think that that's probably most relatable for people. So you see somebody, you see their dating profile or something, and you're like, ooh, I am interested in this person. You might try to gather all of the information you can on them. You're going to scour their profile, get a general sense of how they are, what stories have they shared, what interests do they have, and then you're going to make a decision from that stuff and be like, is this someone I want to spend time with? Same with deities, honestly. It's same with deities. Go read their myths, read their stories, look up what sort of correspondences they have, what realms do they work in, what are the things that they specialize in. Look at all of that. Get a big overview. And get as many opinions as possible. Don't I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I am going to tell you what to do. I really, really, really recommend that you don't just take my word for it. You question all the things. You look at all the things. You don't just find one person who works with that deity, who says that this is the way it's supposed to be, and get stuck there. Because that can be problematic. First of all, that person may not have a good, like a positive view of said deity. That I encounter a lot. I have a relationship with Loki. If you do not know who Loki is, he is portrayed as a villain in most everything ever. And there are reasons for that, and that's another video. But if I were to just go out and look for information on Loki and only pay attention to everyone who's telling me he's a villain, they are a villain, I might not even give this entity a chance. So vary your sources when you're doing research. I personally really enjoy looking for contemporary practitioners who work with that deity and see what kind of experiences do they have. Now, there are other people who believe that that's totally irrelevant. The only stuff that's legitimate is what's in the mythologies, what's been around for hundreds or thousands of years. I personally think that that's a really rigid outlook, and I don't find that to be very beneficial, especially because lots and lots of deities may still have some energetic current kind of wiggling out there, but they're not very well known. Nobody's maybe worked with them much over the past 100 years, or hundreds, not 100. That there may not be stories out there to find. So, talking to people who do work with those entities can give you a broader view of what they might be like. This steps into the realm of what is known as UPG, which is an acronym for Unverified Personal Gnosis. I am not a huge fan of this particular acronym. I don't tend to I don't tend to vibe well with things that tell me that something's like unverified. Because when we're talking about energetic things, they're very subjective, and I get why it's unverified, because it doesn't have the support of hundreds of years of lore or many, many, many practitioners' similar encounters, right? There's not the same level of like kind of collective unconsciousness knowledge about that entity. But that doesn't invalidate what somebody's experience is. So I personally find it to be kind of a red flag if somebody is overly against UPG. That being said, the reason that sometimes people are very don't pay any attention to UPG in their advice in working with deities is because you get people sometimes who come up out of the nothing, and they're like, I work with such and such deity requires this offering from me that no one has ever heard of this deity wanting. And they, their messages are like this, they talk to me like this, again, stuff that nobody else has really ever experienced or isn't kind of in that collective unconscious. I'm not here to tell somebody that they weren't talking to some lesser known aspect of that deity. So let's wrap back around to deities are not that unlike humans when we're thinking about personalities and stuff. If we're talking about personified deity, we're understanding that through our human lens, and our human lens understands other humans. When we think about a human, they are varied and complex. And sure, you could say that I am a YouTuber. I make videos, right? So if you were saying the things that I do, you could totally narrow that down to YouTuber. That's it. That's my whole life. That absolutely would not be true. I have very, very many things that I do. I write things sometimes, I do art, I make videos, I slack on all kinds of stuff, I am in relationships with people, I have a child, so I've been a parent, I teach things, I am a tarot reader. Like, there's so many different like job descriptions or traits that you could apply to me. Now imagine that, do that same thing with a deity who has far more reach than an individual human. When we think about deities and we reduce them to something as narrow as god of war, goddess of war, we have probably left out a whole lot about who they are, what they do, what their motivations are. We hear that and we might just think this is an entity that is 100% focused on conflict. Highly doubtful, right? Highly doubtful. Just like if you looked at me and said, that's a YouTuber, they're 100% about YouTube. No, that's friggin' ridiculous. So why do we do that with our deities? Why? Why do we narrow them down to this one, maybe two aspects of their personality? Sit with that. Think about that. It takes you some really interesting places, I promise. Okay. You know, I didn't really identify, how I define deity. And I meant to. I have notes so that I might kind of stay on track. Deities, to me, and your mileage may vary, deities are energy currents. They are also a consciousness that I can't really understand because I don't personally understand that, but I do understand them as energy currents. And that's where those designations of kind of, you know, when we think of things like God of War or Goddess of Beauty or what have you, those, for me, become the labels for their energy current. So those labels, like, they can have a lot of them, is my point. They might reside in, we will take the goddess Freya, for instance, who I do have a dedicated relationship with in some sort of form. She could completely be narrowed down to a goddess of death. A little less deathy than some other goddesses, but she does have a realm in which she welcomes and holds space for the dead. She can also be described as a goddess of war. There's debate about whether she actually leads the Valkyries or is a Valkyrie, or there's, depending on scholarly outlooks, that's a thing. She's a mother. She's listed as having children in the Eddas. So there's that. That is not really a trait, I think, that most of us immediately jump to thinking about with Freya, because we see things like, if you can't lay 'em, slay 'em, and we just pinpoint her down into this space of like, she is sex and she is death, and that's it. We lose the beauty in there somewhere too, which is like, she is all about that, let me tell you. So when I envision the essence that is Freya, sure, I can put like a human-ish sort of frame on her, because that makes me feel good and comfortable, because, you know, I'm a human and it's easier for me to picture a big old divine consciousness that's so friggin' huge as a human form. But really, when I expand about what she is, I see her more as energy that is almost existing in all of these different streams. So all of the things that she has a hand in and has influence over is kind of the stream, and I can tap into that stream to work with that and to work with her. And that's where I see deities who hold purview over similar ideas have like overlapping energy streams. I don't know if this is making sense to anybody except me, and that's okay. We're still rolling with it. So for example, continuing with the idea of Freya, when I think about Venus or Aphrodite, I can see overlap, like, okay, cool, they have these streams, and the stream of beauty, like, they all kind of overlap in. Just in the same way that anyone else who has ever made a video on YouTube would be in the YouTube energy stream as a YouTuber, and I would overlap with them. Hopefully that makes some sort of sense. So that is how I overall see deity. I don't know 100% if that's relevant to anything, because we're trying to talk about why to work with them, but whatever. So, why would you choose to work with deity? Well, they are really freaking powerful, for one thing. Much more powerful on the grand scheme of manipulating energy and interacting with universal forces than humans are in and of themselves. So there's a huge advantage to working with a deity to getting stuff done. Your magic can quite possibly have a whole lot of extra oomph if there's a deity supporting your magic. That, I think, is probably the most common reason why people are drawn to the idea of working with deity, and why they kind of think that it's a necessity, like that you have to have a deity in order to do magic, like you're not going to be able to do the magic without that deity support. There's also the fact that there's a lot of fulfillment that can happen through a devotional relationship with deity. Through working with Freya, for instance, I have made so many strides in my concept of appreciating myself, my self-love. She is the primary deity that I work with when I'm struggling with my own self-image. And whether that's just internal, like I'm not talking about just physical image, but my own inner sense of worth, because she is all about what is valuable. So anytime that I might not find myself to be very valuable, a quick chat with her will turn that right around. So there's devotional advantages and benefits that you get as well when you have an ongoing relationship with the deity. Sorry about that. I had to pause and edit this just a little bit because the dog started barking, and nobody needs that in their life. They get super excited when like anybody's here. So had to pause it. We paused the recording. We're coming back. It's all good. Okay. Whew. Coming back to the space. Okay. So we've identified some benefits of why we might want to establish a relationship and have an ongoing situation with the deity. And it's important to remember, though, while I'm sharing my outlook on how I work with deity, there are deities out there that are maybe not approachable in the same way. There are deities out there who have very long established traditions in how you approach them, how you work with them, what you do, what the right offerings are. And I do think, as much as I was kind of giving you this, like, yeah, it's all good, do whatever you want, I do think it is incredibly important to be aware of those things and to respect them. And if you are wanting to work with a deity that's in a closed tradition, you need to do the appropriate research and contact the appropriate parties and see if you're able to gain access into the tradition, study the tradition, all of those good things. I am not telling you that it's super legit to just run out there, decide you're working however you want with any deity. especially not if you are advertising that. Like, what you do privately is what you do privately, and nobody really has any say over that. But I do highly recommend that you research the traditions and the histories of a deity before you just go breaking all the rules. I think about that in terms of, so here's my metaphor for this, is poetry. Sure, anybody can throw a bunch of words on a piece of paper and call it a poem, with complete disregard for what the grammatical structures and traditional ways that you form sentences and thoughts with language are. Or you can study the language and the traditions and the grammar patterns, and then once you know the rules, choose to break them. That tends to be more effective, and then what you have created likely is more in line with poetry that is recognized as poetry and not like a bunch of words thrown on a piece of paper. I don't know. I always have to have examples for how things work, so take that or leave that, whatever. Respect closed traditions. That's mostly what I'm trying to say there. Okay, looking at my notes. So, there is no rush. Again, I would like to reiterate that there's no rush. If you just realized yesterday that you are a witch, you do not need to have a dedicated matron, patron, whatever devotional relationship with a deity tomorrow. Not a requirement. Tread slowly. Form your relationship over time. Which takes us to, so how the heck do you? You've been rambling at me for like 30 minutes about what your opinions are on deity. How do I freaking work with one? That's all I want to know. I'm glad that you asked. I'm glad. So like I said, if you were going to date a person and you did some research about them and you were like, oh, this is a fine person. I am very interested in, I am attracted to their appearance or their brain or their whatever. I like what I have found about them. Now I want to meet with them. That is the space that altars and shrines can play. So whereas it may not seem like you can just go grab coffee with a deity, you can. You just got to create the space for it. It doesn't necessarily have to be some elaborate space. It might be. That's kind of up to you and them. They may not show up if it's not the right space, which is where having researched their traditions is really useful, because they may be an entity that only occupies certain locations. If you want to interact with a deity that's very water-based, you may have some trouble if you go to the desert and try to find them, right? So take that sort of thing into consideration. You can build these spaces too. Again, that's what shrines and altars can be about. We can create sacred space to combine with the deity. I'm going to go with that. I meant commune, but we're going to combine with the deity apparently. That's kind of called invocation and sometimes possession. That's again another video. But we create a space where we can meet and have some coffee or tea or water or whatever with your deity. I do bring up I'm kind of serious about the beverage aspect of it, mostly because that's really quite heavy in my practice. I often make drink-based offerings to deity, so take that as you will. But it is completely legitimate to sit back, perhaps provide an offering to the entity, right? Because if you're inviting somebody over to your house, you're not gonna get a drink and not serve them. Make it welcoming. Find things they like. If you want to build an altar or a shrine, again, research them. Find out the things that people have over time discovered that they adore. Put those things on the altar space. When I'm building altars to Freya, there's generally amber somewhere nearby because she's highly corresponded, the word ran away, I don't know, with amber. In her myths, you even hear of her crying tears of amber or gold, depending. Also, I have a lot of little cat figurines because she is said to be carried in a chariot that is pulled by cats. So she tends to get little cat figurines around her. I look for things that are going to make her feel welcome. And then, so how do you have a conversation with a disembodied, maybe not vocal entity? That's where you have to be open to what communication can look like. And understand that communication with deity is not necessarily based on verbal words or words as you know it. Knowing what your strengths in, like, the different clairs, as people call them, the different sorts of psychic awarenesses can be really helpful. You can ask the deity to provide a sign that they have listened to what you have said. That sort of thing. I do kind of hear. I get snippets of conversation. So for me, it is very much like talking to a human. Driving, Freya has talked to me so many times while I'm driving. It's ridiculous. We do definitely have an agreement that there is like no possessions taking place while I'm driving. If you ever decide to go into like possessionary trance type workings, and yeah, that's a good rule number one. It's a good rule number one. None of that. No spontaneous invocation while driving. But I do get like messages and inspiration. We'll call it inspiration. So yeah, basically, if you're starting out, you get to know them and then hang out with them. And that's why I say it's like building a relationship with a human. If you don't hang out with the person that you want to get to know, you're probably never going to get to know them. It's just not going to happen. You got to make time. And that's where devotional relationships come into play. And that's why you see people who maybe like every new moon do a certain thing for a goddess they work with, or, you know, something like that. Because that's the time that they have set aside and made sacred for interacting with the deity that they want to interact with. Before we completely wrap this up, I do want to talk about what the difference is between being called and calling the deity yourself. So I think there's a lot of information out there that implies that unless a deity has, without a doubt, chosen you as a lowly human may not reach out to them. That would be rude. And again, that can be the case with some deities. I'm not going to say that it isn't across the board, but that ain't how I do, because I'm kind of this rebellious trickstery thing. So, in my worldview, it is acceptable that if there is an entity that you are interested in, that you can approach them. And you approach them by getting some information, create an altar or some sort of environment. You may not need or want to create or be able to create a specific altar or shrine. Sometimes just going outside is enough, right? Like I mentioned, if you wanted to work with a deity who's associated with water, go to a body of water if you can, right? If you want to work with Mother Earth, she's underneath your feet. If you go outside and touch the ground, like she's right there. You don't need to necessarily build her an altar indoors, and that might not even make sense. So think about who the entity is when you're thinking about where is the space that you're going to go to commune with them. And then it just takes time. Like any other relationship, you're showing up, you're hanging out, you're getting to know each other. Maybe at some point you decide you would like to petition them for help with some sort of magic. Be sure to give them something in return, because again, when you're thinking in terms of relationship, it becomes a lot easier to understand that there has to be a balance of give and take, or a relationship is really one-sided. And I don't think it's probably a good idea to have a relationship with a deity with all of the things that they may have within their scope of power to be able to do, and the havoc that they may be able to wreak on your life, to try to make that a one-sided thing where you get a whole bunch of everything and you give them nothing. It's just not, that's not the kind of relationship I would want to have. And I would not want to open myself up to enraging, you know, a deity in that fashion. So it's a give and take. If you're going to make a petition, make sure that you know what sorts of... I don't like to think about it in a transactional sense, but for that piece of the relationship, it is kind of transactional. It's... Personally, I prefer overall having relationships with deity that are ongoing and that are more relationship-based than transactional-based. But there are many practices where all of your deity interactions are very transactional. You can think about, like, work with saints. I'm not familiar with that. I don't do that, but I know from what I've seen, from talking with other people who do work often with various, like, Catholic saints and things, you know that this saint requires this sort of gift, and that's how it happens. Like, okay, cool. Again, that's not my world, so don't ask me detailed questions on how that works. Find somebody who knows. But yeah, learn what gifts they want. And you know, when you give gifts, oftentimes gifts come back to you in return. And it creates this cycle of giving and receiving, which is really freaking awesome. And it has been really helpful throughout my life. That my deities kind of have my back. Does that mean that, you know, 100% I've gone through my life and everything is 100% hunky-dory, amazing, and I never have any problems? Not at all. Not at all, because this is still a human life, and things still suck sometimes. But having the deities that I work with, that I have relationships with, help me through those times when things just kind of suck. So... I don't know. Totally interested in what your experiences are, whether you currently work with deity, what that's like for you. This has kind of been my intro rambling to this topic. In future videos, if you're interested, let me know, and I will go into more detail about my specific relationships, well, my relationships with specific deities and what that is like for me. The deities that I feel a general bond to are pretty varied and hail from some different pantheons. And for me, that's okay. Again, I know some people feel like you can only work within one pantheon. They can do them. I will do me. Totally a Freya thing also. But yeah. So if you're interested, let me know in the comments, and I will go into more detail in future videos about my specific deity relationships. And I also have pretty exciting news that I am putting together a course on working with the runes. I have been working with the runes for... Initially, I posted and was like, for 5 years, because that's like really when I got into divination and the magical aspect. But I've been writing with them for like 10 years. And I didn't realize that much time had passed. I was like, what? I freaking love them. They're totally tied into my relationship with Freya. And I'm super excited because it's been like a year and a half of feeling poked by deity to be like, hey, you should teach about this. Other people need to know this. People are always asking about them. So finally I'm listening because I'm a little slow. And I am planning to launch this spring a 9-week course, which will cover the history of the runes, things that I feel everybody needs to know about them before working with them, how their traditional meanings, stuff like that, different ways of working with them, ways to tap into the energy currents and develop your own relationship with them, all that good stuff. Much of what I have said in this video about deity is applicable to how I work with the runes, how I work with tarot in terms of those energy streams. But I hopefully over the next week, I want to get back on track. I've missed two Friday uploads, which is like, So I'm going to try to make a second video this week, probably talking a little bit about the runes and what I kind of envision for this course. So also, if that's something you're interested in, let me know in the comments so I can kind of make a note and reach out to you with all the details when I have figured them out, because I think I know what I'm doing, but gotta dot I's, cross T's, I don't know. Anyway, lots of love to you. Mwah. Thank you so much for going on this adventure with me and listening to me ramble about working with Deity, and I will see you next time. Bye!